Okay. So, I don't, is John, are you the chair? Would you like to call the meeting to order? I can't recall who's the chair.
I think he is.
I am.
Okay.
We've never done it, in that manner, but let me grab my packet, or I'll just call the, ordinance review committee, August 8th, 2022, meeting to order.
Thank you, John. And we have, 3 members here in person, Tron and Ray Randolph, Jerry Pittsford, Bernie Garitos. And then, I also see, Julie Thomas. Staff member here. Okay, so Julie is also joining us via Zoom, so we have a quorum and we can get started. So go ahead and share the screen here with the packet. The purpose of today's meeting is to review chapters that we're considering for removal, modification, amendment of some sort in the county development ordinance that are in our ordinance currently. So I'm glad that the people in the room are here on ordinance review committee. Collectively, you guys have a lot of historical knowledge of some of these chapters and why we put them in there to begin with. So I figure we have until about 5:30 today that we'd like to break this out into discussion, approximately 15 minutes per chapter, or as it necessitates longer. Just keep in mind, we want to get through hopefully just a overall conversation about each chapter, and we can go through it as thoroughly as you would like. So the first chapter that we're looking at is cluster subdivisions. And I'll note that that one was put into the ordinance in 1997. And to date, I had Tammy pull a few files. We've only had 3 cluster subdivisions. Maybe 4, 3 or 4 cluster subdivisions since 1997. So it's not a subdivision type that's actively used. It's primarily used when a property is zoned business industrial overlay. Cluster subdivision is the only type of residential subdivision they're permitted to do. So I do have a zoning map up of the business industrial overlay areas once we get to that section. But I wanted to briefly ask your opinion of cluster subdivisions and then broadly think about whether our current subdivision types we think are adequate. So right now we have sliding scale, minor subdivisions, major subdivisions, and administrative subdivisions. So if there's a need for a cluster subdivision type, or if we can amend one of those subdivision types to incorporate something we like about cluster subdivisions, that's the direction of the conversation that I was thinking for today.
Would you name those 3 again?
Of the subdivision types, we have major, minor, sliding scale, and then administrative, technically.
I thought, I didn't hear the sliding scale. I thought-
Yeah. Yeah. And just a general overview of cluster subdivisions. Tammy, I know you've been looking at one recently. But the idea is to allow for smaller lot size subdivisions in return for greater open space preservation that carries on with the land. So I think the sliding scale was adopted with cluster subdivision type in mind, but there's still a few differences. Tammy, do you have a kind of high level differences between sliding scale and cluster subdivision?
I mean, you can, if you use the cluster subdivision, it allows you to take the density below what the zone requires.
Okay, so it allows you to go under minimum lot
It
size.
does, it's
Okay.
kind of a bonus.
Okay.
But you're also doing a pretty intensive conservation area.
Okay,
That
and it's 4 lots or less, or is it capped at any lot?
is not capped.
Okay, so it
And-
sort of can breach into the major subdivision territory. Okay,
I think the initial thought on this, the clusters were there were properties out there that people, that planning can see that could still meet septic requirements and still meet some of the slope requirements at the time, which are a lot different than they are now. That people could utilize the good portions of a piece of property and then leave what was deemed sensitive alone.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the general characteristic of why the cluster came out. That
Mhm.
I've had in the past, the math is very hard to make work. I mean, it's probably, I'm surprised there were 3. I thought there were only maybe 1 or at the most 2. I'm surprised there were 3. But the thing that jumps out at me with the cluster of 1, you get a 15% bonus of the lots, but then 75% of the revenue you generate off those gets thrown back into an endowment fund. So you're only talking about a 25% margin. If I understand how the cluster works, because like I said, I never dealt with the business end of it. I just knew when someone came in and you started working out the lot size and what the sales and everything were going to be, it made it difficult.
Mhm.
And then I think there was something in there about 50% that you would have to, that it could go up to 50% of the property would go in open space, but only on a PUD, you would do 25.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, the concept is a great concept. Because it does, with the right land, it does provide a density that isn't a rezone, but it provides a density where the buildable areas are clustered together. But the downfall is the map, it seems, never worked. You give up too much.
Okay.
Yeah, Bernie, as you were saying that, I think the idea was that it had good buildable area. And by clustering the houses, because you had all that open space requirement. So the cluster was a way to meet the open space requirement and allow the maximum buildable area to be utilized.
Well, and you know, the open space requirement typically wasn't required unless there was a reason. Like a PUD, unless it was, you know, dedicated right away or easements for floodplain, but you know, that if you had an area, so you just had the top of the knob, right? And you could, it was an agro reserve zone, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if it was an agro reserve zone on that 10 acres of nice flat area, you might only be able to get 4 homes. But in a cluster subdivision, you may be able to get 6.
You have to dedicate 50% of the buildable area. So you find all the buildable area. You put half of that aside for conservation, plus all the
Contiguous.
other part of it that is not buildable,
Right.
kind of can be put into conservation. And what you're left over with, which in a lot of cases, people don't have the topography to work with anything like that, but what's left over is what you can then use for your density bonus.
Right, so the buildable area, what people would find is if there's that much buildable area that you've got to donate 50, that you would donate 50%.
Yeah.
So the real savings would be the infrastructure cost. Because you'd be able to bundle your roads in a certain area where all the houses are. You'd be able to bundle
Mhm.
sewer or whatever physical improvements you got to do to make it accessible or to make it. It would be in a more confined area, and you
Right.
wouldn't have a house, you know, 600 feet away from another one that you would have to run water to, or you would have to run something. Those were the benefits on paper, but again, the math just didn't work, and I can't get too far into that. I mean, actually, that presentation that Steve Smith gave to the
We did well, actually.
thank you. About a month or so ago, we probably proved that point, I think.
Right.
If I remember what the 30,000 foot unit was, so that's all I got. So.
Okay. Commissioner Thomas has their hand raised.
Yeah, I'm not able to start my video. The host has stopped me from doing that, but that's okay. So I agree. I don't know where it's possible to do this. Yes, there are savings in terms of building infrastructure, roadways, sewer connections, etc. you know, on the one hand, I'd hate to get rid of it, but it's not been used much. So I wonder if there's a way to pull this into minor, major subdivisions. I think the benefit, and you know, it's not something that's outlined here because this was before we talked about things like this, but I think one of the things that could be done here would be some sort of shared land for ag. It doesn't necessarily have to be a waterway, right? So it could be shared garden space. It could be something else that becomes that that, you know, open space. And, you know, I'm wondering if this is, you know, intended, it could also be intended for things like golf courses, which we aren't going to see more of those either, but because that sort of is what that feels like to me, is that you can cluster residences together, and then you have that dedicated open space. I think it's too limited in what the open space can be used for. I don't really understand why that much money would need to be set aside. If it's, you know, let's say it's a batch of woods, or something like that, you know, you really don't need to do much to maintain woods. So why would you need to set that money aside? I have a question though, in this section in part C, number 4, it mentions an element of the county's long-range open space network. Do we have that? What is that?
Sorry, you said which section was it?
So it's on page 6, at the top, under number 4. There you go. At the end of that section there.
Long range open space network.
Yeah, I have no idea what that is. I was like, boy, this is something I didn't.
Yeah,
Maybe there could be trails, right? Potentially.
No, open space is open space. I think the plan in the 90s was to think about, you know, maintaining the rural characteristics of Monroe County. That's what it feels like to me, but does that mean farmland? Does that, you know, could mean trails, but that's not really open space. That's a trail. So yeah, if we could look into that, that would be really fascinating, I think.
It is confusing. It almost implies contiguous open space.
That's what I
Right,
said.
right. That you could abut 2 open spaces from 2 properties next to each other and create one larger open space, I think is what they're saying, but I've never heard of an open space network or plan. So
okay, we'll look into that.
I wanted to add in that, so with the cluster subdivision, they're supposed to do primary and secondary conservation areas. And then if you link it to the BIO chapter, those secondary areas can be used for agriculture or industrial uses, or it was just a way to preserve land. Because the BIO is so interconnected with it, they were trying to preserve some of this area for industrial purposes, but also still use it for ag purposes. And we do have one good example of a functioning cluster subdivision that is doing agriculture on its property. It's a working farm with row crops. So just throwing that out as an example of what's happening with one of them.
if we,
Yeah,
Yeah, it is currently only 3 lots, but we have had people inquiring to bring it up to 5 lots. So, yeah. Jackie and I have not worked through how to make that happen with them in a pre-design sense yet.
if we didn't have business industrial overlay, which we're going to talk about next, I guess, but if we didn't have that, there would that's why I'm suggesting if we want to keep elements of this, it doesn't mean we have to keep the whole thing. If we want to keep elements of this, we could put it into the subdivision ordinance instead. If you don't have a BIO, then what happens?
right. Yeah, I'm not really sure why this cluster subdivision isn't in the subdivision control ordinance, and it makes me question what standards we can even apply to it. But one of the things I'd like to ask the group is, what are the components that you do like about cluster subdivisions, I hear maybe an incentive density bonus. Do we want lot sizes to potentially remain smaller in return for permanent open space in a way of like a conservation easement, or, okay, so that's something, is 15%. If we took out the endowment fund, which I agree, I don't think we would want an endowment fund to manage or look at, to follow up on this. So would 50% open space of buildable area still be a reasonable amount?
I'm just gonna jump in because I'm not extremely familiar with cluster subdivisions at all. I've never seen one, never sat in a process of where it was being, asked. So I've never seen a petition. So the one thing I like is it allows exceptions that are based in somewhat more of a predictability for the landowner versus having to go through a PE process to get those same allowances with density and such. So that's all I have to say. I would really like to see an example just to kind of try to visualize it a bit more, understanding and following the conversation, but not being part of the discussion prior to it. I don't see an extreme benefit or
Do you wanna go to?
I just don't really see exactly
Page 6.4.
anything that speaks to me because I'm just not too familiar with it. So
Julie, can you see GIS?
Yes,
Okay, so this is an example of a cluster subdivision here, where they preserve most of this as open space. I think these lots are zoned ag RR, but it doesn't seem like they actually utilize the density bonus in this situation, but their amendment might.
So the amendment would be create one lot out of the woods for an additional home.
Mhm.
And the other one would be to take lot 2 and kind of carve that in half to allow a smaller.
That's
size
their
lot.
proposal, which we haven't
Yeah.
fully evaluated,
We have
but
not evaluated.
so, I mean, even some of the cluster subdivisions are only used because if they are in the BIO, then this is the only option that they have. So.
When they did this, that also created space for the solar farm.
I don't think it did for. I don't think that was part of the original.
No, but I think it was why they were doing it. They wanted to sell part of it, but not all of it.
What year? was
Well,
that?
this was a while ago.
This amendment to was 2019.
2009
Yeah.
was amendment 1.
Yeah,
it seems strange to do this in a BIO because, I mean, in a way, because if the land is supposed to be set aside for business industrial, then, okay, yeah,
That property, those two houses are a mother and a daughter.
right.
And the mother wanted to sell the big part of the ground. That included everything where the solar farm is at the time.
okay. Good enough,
That's how that all came about.
but
So
better,
it makes sense that at the time, the sliding scale subdivision kind of got us out of that thinking, but I guess at the time it makes sense that it would have been, because this would have been a zoning change, correct? So it makes sense because it would have changed densities, it would have changed the lot sizes, and, the setbacks and all the things that, the right of way for the thoroughfare plan, all those would have changed, but
Yeah.
probably because the lot size would have changed dramatically,
right,
possibly. That's probably why they put it in the zoning ordinance.
right,
Now, the sliding scale can do the same thing now, but you don't have to rezone the property, you just submit it to the zoning ordinance, correct? Because you can have lot sizes, and I say lot because it is a platted subdivision.
Yeah. yeah,
But you can have lots that are smaller than what the zoning classification is on the property.
in the sliding scale, just for forest reserve, you can go down to 2.5
Yeah.
acres, yeah.
So the sliding scale subdivision is kind of
yeah,
kick that
taken
paradigm
over
out, but
Yeah.
at the time, you would have had lots that would have been
10
smaller.
acres or,
So it
yeah,
would have,
Mhm.
that's probably why it went in the zoning ordinance.
yeah.
I have a question.
That's a good point.
I'm thinking about the Weininger property down on Clear Creek next to Southern Meadows. I'm thinking about the farms subdivision. Why wouldn't those be in a cluster? Why couldn't they use cluster on that? Because it seems to be encouraging what they were trying to do. But that, I don't remember that ever being considered.
Yeah, I think that, it provides a 15% density bonus from what's there. So if you have a 0.21 acre, you know, take 15% of that. Oh gosh, I think we do math right now. Well, it would be less than 0.21 by 15%, so it'd be like 0.18 or something. So I think they were trying to get a little bit even smaller than that originally. But that could be an option for people, but they'd have to take 50% of their buildable area. And put that aside, not just the 50% of their land, so 50% of the buildable area. So there's still buildable area needs for the rest of the lots, and the transmission line was what they were gonna call the open space or,
Right.
so
Well,
that wouldn't
then,
have counted as,
right.
yeah.
But it also speaks to the low income,
Mhm.
that's the
Mhm.
thing.
So maybe the 50% permanent open space, I
You
mean,
know, yeah, I think that's too high, but anyway, the 50% of buildable space is a hell of a hurdle. Here's my point on this. I remember roughly, but not real specifically when we did this. And it was to do a compact form. It was to, basically put an urban development in a rural area. And I think when you look at areas that are likely to transition, those areas used to be part of the fringe and all that stuff. This is the kind of place where that would really be useful, but we're not seeing it be used for that. So there's a problem with it. As it stands right now, I think this is a turkey. It's just, I see a lot of good in it, but if it's not working, as long as it's been on the books and we've had things like the farm or the farms or whatever the hell the name of it was. And then Weininger's place off of Southern Meadows that couldn't get in on this, then why is it here?
Was the farms the one on that road?
Yeah.
Robertson? Yeah,
Robertson's
Gotcha,
farm.
that's what I thought. Okay.
Right, those two, well, the farms was less on the low income. But definitely the Weininger development. What he was trying to accomplish, but the 50% buildable area setback was impossible to meet.
yeah,
Quick question, sorry, with the septic permit, that's a 1 acre minimum lot size or buildable?
so it's a 1 acre minimum lot size, but that's gonna be removed out of the health department code because of the state statute
Right.
changes, so,
But that's just the lot, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, I just wanted to really clarify that.
Yeah.
That was about septic.
So is
Yeah.
the state
I'm
defined
just
as an
saying,
area?
they don't have any buildable area minimums for,
Buildable
no,
area.
they didn't have an acreage minimum for septic, it was only in our local code, which got taken, which is gonna be amended to follow up with the state code changes. So, yeah, that's something to consider about. I think that the other benefit of cluster subdivision is that you could potentially do equivalent of a major subdivision in a rural area on septic. When you have access to sewer, we would want to encourage a major subdivision to utilize sewer and infrastructure, which then we don't have that built-in open space minimum requirement as much, so. Okay, so maybe there is some interest in maybe either reworking sliding scale to have maybe a smaller minimum lot size for any of the zones in return to maybe, should we consider sliding scale to have a little bit more open space, or is well, they have 55%
Well,
open space right now,
Here's the
so.
thing, and you're gonna
But you can still build
shock
on
people
it.
where it's coming
Yeah.
out of my mouth, but this is the only place that I know of where we talk about income qualified housing.
is
in
the,
the ordinance, you know,
Oh,
this
right.
says, this
Okay.
calls out the fact that
Retail square.
is.
yeah, it's right here.
It's about 70 to 100%, 125%. Right there, yeah.
Okay,
So if we're talking about incentivizing, and I don't know if we are or not, because we certainly passed on one. If we're talking about incentivizing housing for working class families, like what Weininger was proposing, this is the language that's supposed to do that. Apparently it failed. So what's the problem with that? And I don't know anywhere else we incentivize building for a specific income group, except what you're looking at right there. Am I correct?
yeah, I don't believe it's elsewhere.
I like the concept
Oh,
because
sure.
again, I think it helps people direct neighborhoods and to the most buildable portions of a tract, and it reduces. So that could be considered a benefit for the county, and it reduces the infrastructure cost to the developer and to the person that's footing the bill for all the stuff that's going in the ground.
Right.
And I think, and I may be wrong. Well, I didn't want to say that, because I don't probably don't make sense, but I think that is a pretty good incentive for both, for the county and for the developer. I don't say, you know, put them on at odds with each other. I don't mean it that way, but there's a benefit, I think, from what we see at the county is reducing that infrastructure, not having people be tempted to put houses where the county doesn't want them. And I think all the mathematics going 15% and 50% buildable area, and even the LMI, which I don't know if those numbers are good, but they seem pretty reasonable.
Well, but here's the other thing too, you gotta look at this, the devil's in the details. Where the subdivision proposal provides on-site or off-site housing opportunities. It should only be on-site, because what it's doing is allowing the developer to trade
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
Yeah.
off-site or, you know. So if you really want to see them dedicate a portion of the development to this income group, then you have to leave it on site. The other thing though too is that I know that there were questions even on my part about Weininger's assertion that $250,000 was affordable price point for the average working class family. These percentages put the lie to that, you know.
So maybe somewhere else in the ordinance, under one of the subdivisions, there could be some sort of density associated with this. If there was we'd have to look into how other communities provide
I
that
think,
commitment.
right, I
Yeah.
think density and location have to be considered.
Okay.
I don't think you want to see this go, you know, somewhere, you know, 10 miles outside of the nearest.
So you think this should actually,
Municipal area, the city or the town of Ellisville or whatever.
so restrict this to zoning areas that are closer to,
Right, that are
Okay.
most likely to be annexed in the future.
And why is that?
Because this is more of an urban format. With the density that would be allowed.
But there's a large lot. I don't know. I mean-
Yeah, I don't know if it is or not. I don't necessarily see this as an urban form. I mean, because houses are clustered on the knob. You know, they're the whiteboard is the whole property and everything's built there on the paper. Close houses doesn't necessarily mean urban in my view.
Right, well, the reason I think that is because the open space dedication and all that stuff is gonna be nearer to places where that open space is less frequently available. I.e. more urban style development.
okay,
There are just something that that Jerry raised, I think there are real concerns. I mean, it all sounds so great on paper. Oh, this is, you know, workforce housing. This is, you know, low-income housing. You know, first, we have no mechanism to control the price at the outset from a developer. They can say what they intend to do, but prices go up or things change, or they run into a problem in building a road and the price of all the homes go up. We have no mechanism to force a sale at a particular price. And we certainly don't have a mechanism to continue to control the market after that house is built and sold the first time. So it's really difficult to talk about, you know, workforce housing or whatever, because we have no mechanisms to do any of it. We really don't. And in the places where they are doing it, they're controlling the market, and the people who are purchasing homes don't end up getting that equity. They don't build that wealth equity because they are forced to turn over part of the profits of the sale, or the houses are set at a price and the market's controlled. So I just don't see a great solution here unless somebody goes in and gets a tax abatement to build true low-income housing.
Okay, so I've got some good notes on this one. I do want to see if we can just, any last comments on this chapter and then move on to the business industrial overlay. So something.
I have a segue of cluster subdivision and airports, if that is a
Okay,
topic, since we are going to talk airports today.
okay. We could do that next. You wanna, is that okay with the group if we switch to chapter 890 instead of 827 next?
Sure.
Okay, all right.
You want to put up the go to 7305 West Airport Road. So this was another, if you scroll out, there's, I don't know if that's the, yeah, that's a good one right there. That's another cluster subdivision that was done. So lot 1 has a really weird shape to it. And then lot 2, which is shown as 4 acres there, actually has subdivided again, and it is two 2-acre lots. So this is another one that we've studied and analyzed, and there's a property that's to the east that is in the pathway of the airport that is also wanting to possibly do a cluster subdivision because they're in the BIO. The airport is very much against more housing density adjacent to their runways. We had a big discussion about this with Carlos, the director of the airport. So that's just
Catch up. So this is over off Cave Road? Or not Cave?
there.
but-
this is Airport Road.
Yeah, so what's
And
the,
we've looked at this one as a model of like, how do we tackle
Yeah, this
more
here.
Oh,
cluster
okay.
subdivisions?
Is there-
And it's along the railroad there, just to the west of the railroad, is property that they're considering. They've been wanting to try to subdivide it, and the airport really doesn't want them to create more density in this
And look at
area.
the shape of the lot that's left.
Yeah, that's the conservation lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Becomes less.
Again, like, even I feel like when we have used cluster subdivision, it doesn't
Yeah.
meet the really the goal of what, it's just people work within the constraint of, oh, I'm in the
They're playing the
BIO.
math. Yeah,
This is, I guess, what I have to do.
yeah, they're playing with the math. So. The airport zoning was enacted in before, I think, 1986, and it's not a chapter that we routinely bring up or use, and I think it's pretty antiquated. I don't know if people had a chance to take a look at the.
It
890.
seems to me like that airport zoning ordinance is not about the airport, it's about what goes around the airport. And it has to do with height, which is FAA requirements. It seems like for this one, I would want to have Carlos and maybe somebody related or connected with the FAA look at this to make sure that it's still accurate and adequate. It may be outdated in, you know, the lengths, the heights requirements or minimums or maximums. So I just feel like I know we need this zone because people want to build around the airport. We're trying to encourage commercial expansion around the airport. But so we do need this, and there are currently homes in the airport zone. But I just want to make sure we know what we're doing. And I don't know.
Right. I've had some conversations with Carlos. He has been working with a firm, and I'm forgetting their name, but they have worked to get some GIS mapping done with regards to height around the airport. And Tron, you made a very
Crude.
very brief, crude map,
I'll call it crude because I made it
but
in
it,
less than 2.5 minutes, just so I could put
Yeah.
the data that I think he wanted to visualize on a map.
right. So Jared and Carlos and I were working towards getting an overlay for the airport kind of created, kind of situated with height and what they were really wanting to focus on that met the current standards. And then Jared isn't here any longer. And so kind of waiting for a new GIS person to come online, maybe assist with a working overlay map that staff can use to assist with permitting, and maybe incorporate the airport into reviewing some of these projects for height specifically, and train a person to maybe review any permits that are near the airport and have them more involved. Because I think there's associations with grant money that if they can prove that they are abiding by a lot of these standards, that it opens them up to showing that they're doing conservation around the airport for height, that they can maybe get bonus grant money from that. So
Yeah, the FAA is very careful about that.
I just sent you a copy of the map.
okay,
Yeah,
Okay,
I think I started on plan commission like in 2003, and one of the first meetings that I went to outside of just plan commission meetings was business industrial overlay meeting at the airport.
Yeah.
You know, so this is persistent. One of the things that I have always held in mind is there's not a lot of other opportunity for an airport in Monroe County. You know what I mean? So as far as this airport is concerned, it should be to a degree sacrosanct because you can't repeat it anywhere else. And it has to be able to expand if necessary. So, and I mean, this is a long-term conversation that probably needs to come to a good conclusion to protect the airport and the interest that it serves.
yeah. I think talking with Carlos, like Tammy said, we want to kind of understand what kind of commercial development they want to have incentivized. It sounds like, you know, a lot of what they're promoting or seeing out there is a demand for warehousing or storage, convenience storage types of uses that have limited, I'd say limited public, not really retail, more manufacturing or storage uses. And then to reduce the ability of people to like subdivide and have high density residential on buildings that are too tall, things like that. So we can certainly pass this by Carlos and maybe have a meeting with him as well as GIS coordinator when we get the chance to review that map that we do currently enforce height permissions around the airport. That's probably the main reason we interact with Carlos.
Yeah, and the map's pretty straightforward, so
Yeah.
it's more or less, how do you want to view it? What's, do you want a static map that's PDF? Would you
Yeah,
rather see it like on a online where you can zoom in and out? What we can
Yeah.
just discuss further. It's pretty
yeah,
easy.
we can come back to that, yeah, but for the purpose, oh, go ahead. Dan.
Right, one of the other points I want to make real quickly too is whatever zoning we put around it where the houses are essentially encroaching, the residential uses are encroaching. That it be a zoning so that those are pre-existing non-conforming. So as people try to move those properties, they can't continue to be residential,
Okay,
you know, and there should be an incentive on that. To the degree that changing the zoning should change the pricing that they would be able to get. I mean, I would think it would, if it's zone business in the airport area, then, you know, they should be able to get more for it than they would as reselling as residential.
Mhm.
You know, that's just an assumption, so.
Well, it's almost a condemnation process, right?
Right, exactly. It is. It is, but I mean, it's condemnation comes as a necessity. This would be so that if it sells and it's not been condemned yet, you don't have to do a condemnation process. You know, you simply change the zoning where people have come in before and said, wait a minute, I can't sell my house as a house because the zoning's changed. Well, because we don't want it to be a house anymore. You know, that's the reason the zoning changed. You know, if people wanted to protect keeping it as a house,
Yeah,
then they come in and fight the zoning,
right.
you know, but anyway.
I don't want to bring up the IU argument, but it's kind of what IU is done. I mean, but they've gone out and they've seen that their campus may grow and they wanted to go through and buy properties and buy houses and buy what's next to them more than they would elsewhere. It's almost a similar scenario. But I would say that the airport is free to make offers to people as just having a first right of refusal.
Right,
If the airport was serious about taking those properties on, they could come into agreements with their neighbors and say, hey, if you ever sell your house, we want first right of refusal.
right. But I'm wanting to protect the area around it for businesses that are utilizing the airport, not necessarily just the airport.
I thought you were focused on the residential, but yeah, business.
I mean, some of the residential does kind of come into play because
Absolutely.
because it's so adjacent. to-
Yeah, absolutely. So does the airport, and this would be a question for the airport for one, Carlos, excuse
Yeah.
me. Do they actively pursue business of the people that they want? Do they have people that are out there beating the bushes, pounding the pavement to market the surrounding area around to get the users around the airport that would elevate them to the status that they want to be?
I don't know exactly if they're, you know, drumming it up, the interest up to those direct desired, you know, developers, but they are hosting like a 5K. They are doing collaborative measures to bring exposure to the airport. I will say right before 9/11, one of my courses at Ivy Tech was to build a restaurant / convention center concept out there. It was a cool idea, but after that happened, there was a lot of different regulations around the airports, and that project kind of just went wayside. So I'm really interested in what Julie was saying, is getting Carlos's and just the whole airport's perspective on that.
Okay.
And the font on this tells you how old it is.
Yes.
I know. Tells you everything. Okay. Good discussion on 890, so we'll pass that along to the airport. We're also thinking we'll send them a list of uses permitted in the airport zone and go back and forth with them on that, so.
And we have enough data, and with John starting today, we can help kind of, or provide you the shapefile if you want to see, you know, how many parcels are within that, and start kind of seeing how many different zones. and
I
things
feel like
that.
it's a bowl-shaped height thing, because as airplanes take off. And so we will have to decide if we make it more like, look like the eco area and have like buffered like zones, like at this zone, it can't be this height, at this zone, it can't
Right,
be this height.
Yeah.
And maybe do something like that, something that's really easy for us to either zone outright on the zoning map. And be able to like review permits for.
So the residential component, we don't want residential around the airport. Is that because the potential for the number of lives lost? Or is it because we don't want to land on a family home? Because a convention center, a hotel, something
Yeah.
like that can have a lot, I mean,
Yeah,
you remember this, a lot of you don't, but remember when the F-15 flew into the Ramada Inn or whatever it was? At the old Indianapolis,
Indianapolis,
the old airport there.
yeah.
And that's just a remark. I'm just thinking out loud, what are we preserving there? Are we trying to Are we looking at lives lost, or are we looking at getting the highest
Highest
marketability of land that can benefit the airport?
I see.
You
I don't
see what I'm
think
saying?
it's the
Because they-
latter. I think it's the former. And I also think they're worried about height issues and
Yeah, I
obstructions.
think also there's something about the noise as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That they have to have a noise buffer around an airport because of the high frequency sound that comes out of airplanes.
We can ask Carlos that question.
There you go. Yeah, I
Okay.
think maybe some conversation with Carlos and his board might be a good idea, so that we can really make sure that whatever we zone is in the wheelhouse for what they want to see accomplished.
Okay,
And I'm wondering what they're doing.
Have them come.
Right.
yeah,
Instead of just leaning on having an ordinance that may restrict people in an unproductive manner.
yeah,
What is the airport doing? And I'm not saying that they're not doing anything. I don't know. My
Right.
son's Cub Scout troop went out there and we had a great day,
Right,
right? Years and years and years and years and years ago.
right. See, I'm thinking cooperation, not capitulation.
I think it would be good to have a meeting with the airport board and Carlos and talk about planning and what they wish to do. We have some property we purchased there adjoining the airport, which was supposed to be for airport related commercial. So yeah, that there is a lot to talk about.
And real quick, Julie, that leads me to the question that I was wondering, what is the goal of the airport on what size? And I have no idea, what size jets, what size planes, what size
Right.
aircraft can be
Right.
can land there, or what do they want to do? I
Right,
mean, you got 48 on one side and you got 45 on another side,
right.
Mhm.
so.
Do they want to move to small passenger? They don't fly much at night, so is that going to change? And the safety issue is the strange one, because if you think about most of the flights at the airport, they're daytime. Most houses are not full at daytime, but businesses are. And that's, so I don't know. I think it would be really good to have a conversation about what they want to see there, what they plan to do. I mean, there are two huge lots right now that they've put in an ARPA funding request to provide water and a packaged sewer plant in. So, that I think it's worth having that conversation and really thinking about what it is we're going to do with that airport and what's going to happen next, or what might happen next.
Julie, what is ARPA?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's the American Recovery Act money.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the money that every county and city received and town received from the federal government for COVID recovery, economic
Yeah.
recovery.
I've never heard that.
We've got 21 items on our list. We're going to have a survey on our website for folks to chime in on what they think we should work on.
good.
Just one more thing about the airport. I was working, I can't think of who the previous director was prior to Carlos.
Oh,
Patton, Bob,
Bruce,
Bruce.
yeah,
It was Bruce. I was working with Bruce with creating a airport farms fields. So I know that there's a lot of farm fields with directly adjacent and surrounding them. So,
yeah,
and I think there's some incentive for those farm fields with the airport. So I would kind
Yep.
of follow up on that. and
That's-
see if
We
that-
do a leasing, right? There's a leasing program, but it could also become a solar field too. So there's some other options out there.
Right, no, I'm not saying that, I'm just remembering that was something that they were really wanting some clarification, because they needed to send some of these calculated acreages and numbers up the pipeline.
okay. So that's me, solar farm, right.
The solar farm, we had an intern that worked on that. and The
Yeah.
infrastructure is just not there to do it, and you really do have to take into consideration the glare.
Yeah,
Those were the two main.
There's
things I
there's solar
remember.
panels. There are solar panels designed for airport
Yeah.
regions.
Yeah, Indianapolis would be your.
Yeah.
Yep.
okay, maybe we wanna look at the business industrial overlay next. We've got some good next steps on the airport, so thank you for that.
Do you want to flash the BIO map?
I will flash the guy.
It gets smaller, it never gets bigger.
Yeah, no one is ever actively rezoning to the VIO. We don't hear that request.
Have we ever denied a BIO reason?
To get out of the VIO.
Yeah, we've done that.
So
You
there's
denied
one-
them?
We did
Yeah.
that when, we had a BIO overturned, in, I think it was Indian Creek or Van Buren, because there's supposed to be an I-69 exit there and there wasn't.
Oh.
The state never put it in, so we removed that one, because somebody was doing something with some property there
Oh.
related to a residential subdivision or something.
But my question is, has there ever been one not
Approved to get rid of the overlay.
approved to get removed? I've done about a half a dozen or maybe 10 and been successful on all of them, just
Yeah, to me, the only reason to have a BIO at this point would be to consider what we need to do around the airport. And that to me is the only thing, because there's nothing else out there that I think has to be, set aside for a massive auto plant or something like that. I'm not even sure we have that kind of land available in general, but I just think BIOs are a thing of the past, and I don't think they're needed. That's just me.
can I ask a question? Do we think that it hurts anything to have it?
It does limit people's residential subdivision capacity.
Okay.
And it changes
Also-
what they can do commercially with property too. You can't do something small. So I don't know. I can see the airport having one.
Yeah, so it applies to land within the ag RR zoning district, and I think the idea was that it would go from ag to like light industrial, heavy industrial, so not anywhere in between. And I'm not sure if it was taken into consideration nearby residential areas, because something is rezoned to heavy industrial that was ag, that's a pretty big transfer of zoning or change in zoning.
I have a comment maybe.
Sure.
With some of these areas, I guess, that have, operating business and now are, pre-existing non-conforming businesses, it limits their ability to almost do anything on their properties. Do we not think that a business overlay, not on all of them, but on a few areas, and I can think of a few, that it couldn't necessarily be useful to kind of allow them to have, some ability to have moderate growth or changes to, what they're doing. One that comes to mind, and it might be an interesting discussion, but is the Trailhead pizza shop in the cabin. Those places have been there forever. They're kind of almost staples in this community, but they can't really do anything because they're all pre-existing, non-conforming. And a business overlay and kind of very restrained with maybe even those same parcel parameters could allow them some flexibility. That's the only kind of
Wouldn't it
thought
make
I
sense
have on this outside of.
on
maybe
that
fair.
example, John? Wouldn't it make sense to rezone them?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a number of different options out there, but this allows, flexibility in their current state, which I think would be less onerous for those businesses to do things if they are permitted versus having to go through a whole rezone process. They're both, I think,
They still-
possibilities, just, I just wanted to add my comment. I don't really have a position there, but I think we have made it really hard on a lot of businesses that have been there and now are pre-existing non-conforming. And the only other use I could see for this is allowing those areas where, you know, we find that appropriate use, and they have been kind of staples to the community for such a long period of time. Not that I'm advocating for these areas, I'm just wanting to bring up these top points.
Right, but they'd have to rezone anyway, so. A BIO is not a zone, it's a zone, I mean, it's a zone indication, it's a zone, it's like a comp plan in a way. They'd still have to rezone.
Would they? If they wanted to do anything on their property?
Yeah, and I can get to your examples. Those are actually zoned differently, but yeah.
So, okay, so the hang up that people had, because I remember oddly enough, it's right next to, very near the airport, the BI overlay down at airport and Bunger. Maximum residential density of one dwelling unit for every 5 acres. So the BI overlay fits in what I'm trying to do is make sure I'm understanding your point, but BI overlays in the agro reserve. Right?
Mhm,
So you've automatically split your density by 50%.
mhm.
And then by the ordinance, the max is 20% of the total buildable area for residential development. So it does hang up people who just want to continue to live and break up the ground for whatever, selling, for passing it on, for
Right.
equity, for whatever they do.
Commissioner Thomas, you have your hand raised?
You're on mute.
Sorry, yep, I think some of these overlays were created when we didn't know where I-69 exits were going to be. I think that's, you know, and it's important to think about why things got to be where they are.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of this too. We have to think about, we know the exits are in, we know where they are, so.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, good point. And I think, so, Sean, your point about allowing expansion of pre-existing business, we have right now pre-existing business zone, that I think you are on something that, you know, should we just rezone that to the zone that makes it conforming, or is there some sort of status that could apply to something that's currently non-conforming and we want in a holding pattern to see what's gonna happen? I don't know if an overlay is really the best way to do it. The eco overlay has worked out pretty well, but it's just that the ordinance for that chapter is pretty well written, pretty clear, and impacts so many people. The BIO is just very rarely used, and people don't even know when they buy property, it's in the BIO. It's not even something they ask about. So,
Yeah, and
yeah,
the distinction with it being already zone ag.
yeah,
Is critical to the discussion, and I just
Right.
overlooked that, but that's kind of where my concerns were.
Okay.
As these discussion precipitate, what can we
Yeah.
do with some people that have found themselves into this pre-existing non-conforming, and is there any way to give them flexibility, or should we even give them flexibility?
okay,
Like I said, I just want to ask the question.
okay.
I have one more question, on the BI overlay when it comes to business. What, and I should know this, but I don't, what are the incentives to utilize the business industrial within it as far as density goes?
Residential density,
No, business industrial densities. Would
well,
that be a rezone? Would
it
that,
is still rezoned, but I think that the idea is that it would be a very, the recommendation would be approval because of the BIO is sort of like you mentioned, the comp plan to say, well, this is a holding pattern until you want to be LI or HI.
that's what that's where I was going with it. It just
Yeah.
doesn't. You know, while the concept of having areas we realize are maybe suitable for business are important, I don't know that anybody really wins other than just knowing what if you have a track, what can be done with.
Mhm,
based on the height, bulk density,
mhm.
all the other requirements.
Right, it adds almost an extra zoning confusion or layer on top.
I almost, Jackie, I almost feel like we did a pre-design where someone was wanting to do a commercial subdivision north of the airport, but I don't think we were gonna deem it cluster because it wasn't gonna be residential.
Yeah, it was confusing, and there's cluster subdivision regulations under 826 that are additional to 827, so.
Is that property, the Horn property just north of 48?
It's
That big parcel, because we did A+ trucking years
Yeah.
ago,
Yeah,
and that was a great fit, and
Yeah.
actually Bruce came to the meetings and.
Yeah.
But that was a business, it wasn't
Right.
residential.
Right.
And I remember there were height requirements, and
Mhm.
I don't think Julie was a commissioner at that time. I think that was, Iris was still Iris. And, Iris. Maybe, I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
so, just to get back to the BIO, does anyone have any issue with us just striking that? Anything that you want to retain in the BIO? Maybe just look at those AGR areas and go with a fine tooth comb of whether they should be ag, or maybe some of them are suited for industrial if they're.
I guess my thoughts go with what Bernie just said, and then reading 827-4 business and industrial uses within a BI overlay. I mean, that very last sentence, the rezone is required prior to final plat approval. It's like, it just is another layer, right? Is it just to show that we have pre-existing favor for the rezone? I mean, so yeah, that's kind of outside of my comment earlier, which, is rooted in zoning, and that is applicable, but yeah, I feel like it's another layer of kind of, going through our ordinance. Go ahead, Julie, sorry. I'm glad your hand was up. I probably would have rambled there a little bit.
Sorry. Hey, I want us to think, this is related, but not directly on point. I apologize. I want us to think about, really supporting agriculture in our community. We don't do it. And, if we see, land, it's like, oh, I could build a business there. I could build, apartments there. I could, and there's not a great deal of good quality ag land left in Monroe County. And I would really like to get some sense of those prime pieces of ag land. I think one of our best pieces of agricultural land is sitting under print tax right now. And that was a real shame. So I just think we really need to have a diverse economy, and we need to think about that, and maybe even creating some sort of a zone where organic farmers can work unhindered by a neighboring parcel that's spraying chemicals and things like that on their crops. So I just want to throw that in there. It's not just about, building factories. We have to feed people too.
Yeah, at planning conferences, they've talked about in denser areas, making sure you keep a green belt around your community, just because it reduces shipping costs and gets, food to table. Like,
I would like to ask the same question that you posed to us. Do you see any issues with striking this overlay? This planning, have any concerns?
Not really.
So then do you think most of it would go back to residential zoning, or do you think most of it would go back to a bit? Because that's really the question.
Yeah,
And with respect to what Julie's saying, I understand exactly what she's talking about. But you've got farms out there where, one of the things that we can do to help perpetuate the farm is, and I don't know that we've got these size tracks. I mean, I think of Joe and Joyce up on North Maple Grove, Peden up on North Maple Grove Road, where they've got acreage there, and they could carve out different parcels for Phil to live, or for
Rachel.
thank you, where they may put their family or something, and then the grandkids and blah, 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 blah. But those are where the acreages are, farm. I mean, if we're talking about over here by Airport Road, really the farm that was that's right across the road from Fairgrounds. I mean, that's the big parcel. Then you've got the Condor Farm that's out there, the airport. I mean, but those are really the only ones.
Right.
And those people would probably rather be able to break it up and have a couple lots on there either to sell, which is
Yeah.
okay, for their retirement or for whatever, or for family to maybe perpetuate it.
Right.
With those areas, you just don't, I mean, you need thousands of acres to really,
For some.
yeah.
farms.
Now, aside from Julie's organic example, I'm not educated enough on it to say what the demand is for that and the longevity. I just really don't know, so.
Yeah, I think that the main thing that I would see with the BIO going away is making sure to determine, ag R versus industrial. And then also, I mean, we see a demand going back to cluster subdivision for people calling in to say, hey, I only want to carve out an acre. I don't really want to break up my land too much. So if we can consider some of the larger farm areas to be allowed, maybe going back to the remnants of cluster that we could maybe incorporate into the sliding scale. We can think about how to do that to let them have a density bonus to allow them to not further subdivide the farmland, keep it contiguous. So I do see that happening a lot. People, the farm is now on 4 lots, which maybe they can still operate that way, but a lot of people turn it into grass and pools and other things. So,
Hayfields.
hayfields.
I think the BI overlay was kind of an albatross from the very beginning. I think some idea of how to preserve area, especially as we talked about around the airport and maybe some other areas. But that's a long conversation that we need to have to do something to preserve areas that we want to see, eventually move toward industrial. And
Yeah.
This is not the mechanism for it.
Right.
It just doesn't
It
work.
kicks the can a little bit,
Right,
puts the impetus on the owner with some
Yeah,
limitations.
this is what happens when there is a lot of opposition to a concept,
Mhm.
and you try to write it so that everybody feels like they're getting
What they
part of
want.
what they want. This is really a bad compromise ordinance.
Yeah,
It's what you're looking at right there.
yeah. Okay. Okay, so we will look into BIO, but mostly we're gonna be getting rid of it, and considering some of your thoughts here today, those have been helpful.
I think incorporating the airport zoning into a little bit of that might be helpful.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, okay, okay.
And I
Taking a
think,
closer look at those
right,
BIO layers.
by and large, I think the areas where we really want to encourage industrial for the next 20 years are already identified.
Yeah,
With industrial zone.
Yeah.
I don't see a great need for overlay for business and industry. I think we've already got employment as a comprehensive plan designation.
Mhm.
We've got industrial in several different iterations to meet the needs that we foreseeably have.
Yeah.
The airport's the outlier.
Right.
We can take care of that and just let this thing go.
Right. Okay,
I would add really quickly that I think an airport zone kind of serves as its own BIO. In other words, we might not need this
Right.
at all, but if we create an airport zone that's effective, it will get us where we want to go at the airport, and we don't need a BIO.
yeah,
Right, and Julie, you're absolutely correct. The very beginning of the BIO conversation was because of the airport.
mhm. Yeah. Okay. And just to follow up on that, Julie, are you saying that you would want the surrounding, and I know we talked about this just for the last conversation, but are you saying that airport zoning could apply to the residential areas that maybe we identify as problematic or of issue? Okay, so those would be.
Yeah,
exist for
I
those.
think so. And I think there are already homes in the airport zone, right?
Yeah,
So,
extend it further.
Right,
Okay.
and as we do that, I think it would be really good because people have had their zoning changed and not been aware of it. And in some cases, it doesn't really change significantly. It just keeps them, it happens very seldom.
Yeah.
But where the airport's concerned, I think those residential structures that we are changing to be in the airport zone, it might be good to specifically notify them
Yeah,
when that
make
occurs.
it a little bit clearer, yeah. Okay, that's good, good thought. Okay, so now we're moving on to 835, which is rural community zoning overlay. This actually has been utilized somewhat, I think, maybe in the last 6 years, maybe 2 or 3 times. It's again a good idea, but in practice is a little bit difficult. I think that the goal of the RCZO was to allow for more urban form in the designated rural community areas. In return for having some multi-use or mixed-use allowances, they could have a sidewalk and a 2-story structure. But this isn't always easily accommodated with the rural community areas, and some of those structures are even historic, so to demand a certain build out isn't always possible or a good idea. So we are thinking we're gonna create, we have proposed a rural community zone that I would like to incorporate the rural community plans that helped put this chapter together. And I didn't know if there were any ideas or proposals under this chapter that you particularly liked.
I want to jump on this really quickly because
Yeah.
I actually was on town council in Ellisville when this started.
Mhm.
We had a conversation with planning staff. They went around, and talked to all the rural communities that were identified. It was a good conversation. And then as this was approved, I'd actually ended up on plan commission because I moved out of the city limits or town limits of Ellisville. So I'm familiar with the whole history of this. This has been very good in terms of advisory, where we are developing properties that are near those rural communities.
Yeah.
Very beneficial. What this is right now, again, is an outdated thing. I think maybe a whole new dialogue. The town of Ellisville now has their own planning board that did not exist when this conversation started, and I don't even think it existed. Well, the planning staff, they had a plan, they had a zoning, planning and zoning commission, but they didn't have a staff.
Yeah.
So now they have a staff that did not exist, I know for sure. So I think that conversation needs to be revisited. And any of the trustees representing some of the other rural communities have an opportunity to come and speak on that. But as this is written and as it stands right now, it's not extremely beneficial, except in those areas where we get close to it. So I don't think
Yeah,
we've done a lot of developing in those areas.
I really see this as a good, I don't know that I would call it an overlay. I don't know if we just need to just increase the densities. In places like Unionville. I don't know if that's the answer. I don't know what the answer is, but it seems like, we had the Harrodsburg housing development brought to us. I mean, to me, that kind of fit into this idea of trying to provide housing in our, near our rural communities.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Julie.
So that's okay. I'm just thinking through it, and I can see I'm not really thinking about Ellisville because it has its own thing, and so I'm thinking more about Harrodsburg and Unionville and New Unionville, and and there are, Smithville, Sanders. I think what we should do is really have conversations at some fire stations in those areas and talk through, planning and zoning specifically about these areas that already are higher density, but could expand, their footprint with more higher density. I think the commercial side and the you know, having commercial with residential overhead and, you know, on the second floor or whatever, is a really good fit in a rural community, but I don't see anybody doing it.
Right, well, a lot of the conversation was about transition to transitioning from the rural community into the greater rural area, or transitioning in the opposite direction toward the more urban areas where there are some urban areas contiguous. You know, unfortunately, a hell of an opportunity was lost with this because Ellisville just grew into Bloomington. So there is no Ellisville anymore. There's still an Ellisville in terms of it's incorporated town. It has its own governance and all that stuff. But as far as the look of the community, it doesn't exist anymore. It's just connected to Bloomington. You know, and this should have been an opportunity to prevent that from happening. But Ellisville seized the opportunity. They started zoning farther and farther out. I mean, getting past Union Valley Road was a hell of an obstacle when I was on town board, and now they're all the way out to Smith Pine. So, you know, that ship sailed. They made it, everything that they developed made everything look just like Bloomington. So they got what they wanted, or they got what they deserved, whatever. But that opportunity to preserve Ellisville as an independent entity through this didn't work.
I think we need to think about the goals of why we would do this, right? And to me, it seems to me that having a rural community means that you are encouraging the development of small commercial enterprises that can serve people who can within walking distance get some basic groceries or whatever it might be. I don't think it's about a transition in my mind so much as it is about providing, you know, that, you know, tiny village atmosphere where people, you know, why bother having a Unionville or New Unionville if there isn't something there that.
Like a vape shop.
So anyway, that's just, I'm just offering that as my thinking on it, but I really would want to hear from people who live there now. What do they want, and how much density is appropriate, and what kind of commercial do they want to see? And, you know, can they attract some small commercial enterprises? I don't know. I mean, you know, we see Steinsville stuff, you know, really having a struggle with that. So yeah, so I think we just need to talk to the folks.
Well, I'll say from a New Unionville perspective, like, and Unionville, like, it's very limited because of the topography out on that east side of the community. We've got, it's basically ridgetop development. There's not a lot of room to grow. We also don't have sewer out there. Plus we have the sensitive watershed for eco that kind of slams into it as well. So like those two, it would be really limited, and maybe just having that RC zoning in a couple of small spots would be most applicable. But in areas where we might see the opportunity for sewer, like Harrodsburg and Smithville does not have sewer, but it does have topography that I think they could expand into and could get a facility someday. So that seems maybe more applicable than the Unionvilles up there.
But what happens when that grocery store goes away in, you know, New Unionville? What replaces it?
The thing I like about your comment, Julie, was that, you know, Jerry's example of Ellisville, we put an overlay on it to maybe try to convince Ellisville that they wanted to be something that they didn't obviously want to be.
Right.
Now, a percentage of the population may have wanted it, but not enough of the population.
Right.
So
Well,
to me, that's the critical factor is, and I think that when this was, and I wasn't part of this discussion at all, but I remember when it went through, and that was, I think, the gist of the conversations were, what do you want? You know, the fire station meetings that Julie's talking about, what do you want? What do you want it to look like? How can we help? And then by helping, maybe the county doesn't necessarily try to get anything out of it other than help the rural community get what they want.
Vision what they want, yeah.
Yeah, you know, and it's. But when you made your example, it's like, well, maybe that's what Ellisville wanted. I mean, they had to fund the schools, great school over there, great fire station, great police station. They've got State Route 46 going through, which is kind of an arterial thing, for people to get a handle on how to develop there, but overall. Are we trying to tell the rural communities to be something they don't want to do?
Right, and like I said, this really was just empowering language from my viewpoint. It wasn't command language. And it was done through conversations at the firehouse and all that stuff. That's the way this was done up, you know. And Ellisville, you know, could very easily, this would have prevented. If Ellisville hadn't extended its zoning authority, this would have protected them from things that happened. You know, but once they took over the zoning of it, they got exactly what they wanted, you know.
And let's not forget, let's not forget that some of the constraints that we put on these areas are restraints that we impose on them.
Right, right, and that didn't happen.
You're right, absolutely.
All right, where are we, because we're getting close on time.
Conversations at fire stations.
Yep,
Ah,
yeah, we've talked
I
to,
mean, it rhymed, that's why I chuckled over
Right.
it.
You're that could be a placard.
I could
I
just
think,
get-
I mean, I'm just pulling up the maps that we have for the rural community areas. This isn't, I don't know if this is all of them. But the,
Steinsville is filled in. We did that in
yeah,
2010.
yeah. so-
I feel like we still need some way to designate rural communities, so that they are recognized, you know.
Right.
If historically protected,
Primary
you know,
growth areas.
and
are
then
red,
as you
that way.
develop toward them, you have to keep that in mind.
Mhm.
I don't know how best to do that, but that's my thought.
Yeah.
Tammy didn't like that, she gave me a weird look.
Well,
Jerry, one of the things that we did with the Historic Preservation Board of Review is we worked on getting some signage at some of the rural communities. These are communities that no longer really exist, but historic communities like Dolan and Hindustan. You know, getting signage out there to acknowledge what was there, even if it's not there anymore, I think is important because it is part of our history. But I guess I'm just trying to think about what to do with residents who live near these areas. And I think part of the problem with some of these, especially Unionville, New Unionville, State Road 45, is that the state has not been willing to make that state roadway safe for pedestrians and bicyclists. So it's not like you can just walk down the street if you live, you know, half a mile from Unionville. You can't just walk down the street safely. There's nowhere to go. There's no way to get there. And I think that's a huge problem that doesn't exist in Harrodsburg and Smithville Sanders. So maybe we can focus on those two.
I'll say from a planning standpoint, we haven't used the RCZO a lot. But what we do use it for is determining when someone subdivides, if they need to do sidewalks or not. And so sidewalks do kind of come into play with this overlay, whether we require it or not.
Right,
Like, I mean,
Maybe
that's how
Ellisville
we
is just too
currently, that's really how we currently use it.
Maybe it was just too big at the time. You know, I mean, thinking about it, should we look at what kind of population area?
well, Ellisville now is over 7,000. And when we first started this conversation, they were at about 5,200.
Mhm.
So
believe
that, you know, it does, it definitely invites the question as to whether or not Ellisville is still a rural community. You know, so maybe
I don't think it is, because it has its own, like the town of Steinsville wouldn't be considered a rural community, even though it really is. It's got its own town board. So as soon as you have your own
Exactly.
government, we don't, you know, we're not involved.
Right, I think of and I don't think it's there anymore, but used to, as you went into Unionville, there was a sign that said, unincorporated limits of Unionville.
Mhm.
Really?
Yeah, so it designated the unincorporated town of Unionville. On the serious, my hand to God, it said unincorporated.
Yeah,
There were a lot of communities that had those signs up.
Yeah. I like the idea of focusing back in on some of the alternative transportation maps and connecting some of the rural areas, and then also talking to township trustees and the people in those rural areas about these maps and or looking at the zoning and what they're used as.
Well, I think we should make a
Clarify
serious
that.
decision as to whether or not we want to leave also in our own community, because I
I
think
don't
you're
think
right.
we will.
I don't think we should, but,
Yeah.
you know, I think everybody on planning commission should get a chance to
Okay,
hear about that.
okay.
I don't necessarily think there's gonna be opposition, but I think
Okay.
it should be discussed as a body so that everybody's aware of it.
It's
Okay,
definitely a change.
But they do have a Envision Ellisville thing being rolled out as well.
Right. I wish they'd just straighten up their stinking lines so they don't have high shapes everywhere. Tried to clean that up for years when I was on that town board.
okay. Well, that's all I had. Does anyone else have any last thoughts or comments? I know there's been items in the chat.
Move for adjournment.
Okay,
This was a fun meeting.
oh, good.
It really was. I think it was a fun meeting. It's.
I'm only rushing off because I have trash and recycles in the back of my truck. And I gotta get this done.
Yeah.
got
All right,
rain coming.
thank you.
All right,
Thanks, everybody.
thanks, everyone.
All right,
Do
yeah.
you need to write somewhere?
No, no.
Okay.